Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's event from the Jesus College Intellectual Forum. My name's Julian Huppert. I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus College, Cambridge, which you can see behind me in a slightly sunnier time, but with the wisteria very appropriately showing. We are recording this event for those who can't be with us, but we are really delighted to have so many of you here live for this event, people who've joined from around the world. And I'd particularly like to add a welcome to those joining us from West Africa through our friends at Phillips Consulting Limited. It's great to have you all with us. Jesus College is an ancient institution. We've seen the world change many times since we were originally founded as a 12th century nunnery and became a full college of the University of Cambridge in 1496. We've seen civil world wars and, of course, many pandemics in the past. The Intellectual Forum itself is rather more recent. We were set up about 4.5 years ago to get people thinking and talking about important issues and to reach out beyond the boundaries of our own college. And in that time, we've had amazing stellar speakers from around the world, all sorts of people, including Jimmy Chu, the fashion designer, former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark, director of NASA's Deep Space X-ray Observatory, Professor Belinda Wilkes, Al Jean, the executive producer of The Simpsons, and many more. Just last week, we had the Assistant Director General of the World Health Organization, Peter Simpson, talking about vaccine equity around the world, obviously a crucial issue at this stage in the pandemic. And we also show off the amazing work that's being done by many of our own academics, such as those using synthetic biology to come up with a new, safe, clean way of dyeing clothes, to experiments with the coldest things in the universe that are even colder than outer space. Just last night, we had Professor Peter Williamson talking about business ecosystems, a far cry from the hierarchical, controlled business organization of the past. If you want a real treat sometime, have a look at the Jesus College YouTube channel, where many of these past amazing events are captured for you to watch. And tonight, I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Jaideep Prabhu to speak to us. Jaideep is the Jawaharlal Nehru Professor of Indian Business and Enterprise and Director of the Centre for India and Global Business at the University of Cambridge. He's noted for many things and advised and consulted and taught for many companies, but particularly for his work on innovation and especially frugal innovation. How can you do things that are new, cheaply and effectively? And today he's going to talk mostly about his latest book, which changes the focus from business innovation to government innovation. How should a government be? So we're going to hear from Jaideep, and then there'll be a chance for you to ask your own questions. So please do use the Q&A function on Zoom. You're probably quite familiar with it. You should see it at the bottom of your screens to ask those questions, and I will put those to Jaideep. We can't guarantee to get through every question. There may be just too many for the time. And please do also tweet along. You can use #IntelForum and @IntelForum to keep that conversation going. And Jaideep, it's a huge pleasure to have you with us. So Jaideep, over to you.
Thank you, Julian, and hello, everyone. It really is a pleasure to be doing this today. While Julian was telling you about all these past speakers, very distinguished people speaking about so many fascinating topics, I was wondering to myself, what am I doing in this company? So I'm certainly very honored to be asked, and as I said, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. As Julian said, I'm a professor in the business school, and so you may wonder, what's a professor from the business school doing talking about government? So here is my talk. I'll speak for about maybe 20 minutes, and then, of course, we'll open up to conversation and discussion. How should a government be the new levers of state power? Now, as Julian was saying, I've spent my career studying innovation, mainly in the private sector, and I've been particularly interested in this notion of frugal innovation. Over the last decade or so, I have closely followed how small teams can increasingly do what only large companies or big government labs could have done before. And we see these teams develop highly affordable solutions faster, better, and cheaper across sectors, from healthcare to education to financial services, energy, and on and on. And often these solutions address social problems that impinge on public services and the state. So we see this, for instance, in software. WhatsApp was famously built in less than a year by 4 people with about $250,000 in seed funding. Very quickly, they generated huge value for hundreds of millions of people who went on the app and used it regularly. And of course, it generated a lot of money for the founders themselves when they sold to Facebook for about 20 billion. So we see this in software. We see this in hardware. This is one of our former students at Judge Business School, a mature student, Eben Upton, who was doing a part-time MBA at the Judge while he was in the computer science department here in Cambridge, responsible for student admissions. And he and his colleagues came up with this idea of the Raspberry Pi, this very basic computer you see him holding in front of you. It's a microprocessor. Their idea was this would help to teach young kids how to compute, how to combine hardware with all kinds of other hardware and tinker with computers, and to code. And initially they thought they'd sell a few thousands of these. They've sold several million, not only to kids, but to makers more generally, people who are combining these with all kinds of other open source hardware to make all kinds of frugal devices. So we see this in software and hardware. We see this in emerging markets. This is an example of Vodafone's service, M-Pesa, that was introduced in Kenya in 2007 to allow a woman like this from a village in Kenya to call her son, who would be working in Nairobi, earning an income. And she could not only speak to him from a mobile phone, but ask him to send money home, which he could do by texting it to her as e-float, which she would accept onto her phone, and then cash in her local corner shop, which would be an M-Pesa agent. So we see these kinds of frugal financial inclusion initiatives using what's already there, joining the dots. We see this in emerging markets. We see this kind of innovation in the developed world. This is a spin-off from UC Berkeley called CellScope. And this company makes a whole suite of medical devices which essentially leverage the computing power of smartphones and their connectivity to do telemedicine. So this is an otoscope which enables a mother to take high-resolution pictures of the inner ear of her daughter when she has an infection and send the image to a consultant who's somewhere else. This device is a fraction of the cost of the standalone device. And of course, it enables telemedicine. So this is really a global phenomenon. And as I said, and as Julian said, I've researched and written about this phenomenon. A book that first came out in 2012 looked at this phenomenon in the context of emerging markets like India. We called it Jugaad innovation after the Hindi word that describes this kind of approach. But this book had examples from other emerging markets in Africa and Latin America as well. That came out in 2012. It was very much about emerging economies. And then we followed up with a book in 2015 called Frugal Innovation, which was about the same phenomenon in the West for the West, and where we looked at not only startups, but also how large corporations were using this approach in their own organizations. Now, when I was talking about these books and gave talks like this to audiences after they were published, from wherever these audiences might be in the world, invariably somebody would ask me the question, so what does this mean for governments? What are the implications for the state? And so I started to think about this question, and I realized that actually this phenomenon had two sets of implications for government. One, for how the government does its own work, how the government itself might be a frugal innovator and learn how to deliver services and products to its citizens faster, better, cheaper. But there was also this aspect, this other aspect of what the government's role might be in the economy, how the government might then manage this kind of frugal innovation in the economy, how it would regulate it and cultivate it. And so I began to think about this question and talk to people and research it. And 5 years later, I have this book. And of course, in the book, when I was researching it, I had to think about what people had said about this question before. How should a government be? And really, there's about at least 100 years of debate between two sort of polar views in response to this question. On the one hand, you have libertarians who are generally skeptical of government and think that governments are ineffective and inefficient at best and can actually be dangerous if given too much power. On the other hand, you have statists who are much more sanguine about the role of government. They think that governments are the only force that can redress some of the vagaries and injustices of nature of the market. And there's an element of truth to each of these polarities. Yes, governments can be inefficient and ineffective, But equally, we see that governments have increasingly important roles to play in the economy and society. So the question I ask is one of a middle ground, which is, can governments be efficient and effective? And can they do that without trampling on our freedoms? And can they do it not only in times of stability, but also in times of crisis like now? And I try to address these questions not sort of in the abstract, but by looking at actual cases from around the world. And I start by looking at a case from a country I'm familiar with, India, and a case that I know something about. And that is this initiative to give every Indian a unique 12-digit ID linked to their biometrics and a few demographics. This initiative was led by Nandan Nilekani, who you see here, who is one of the founders of India's perhaps best known software company, Infosys. In 2009, he left the private sector to go work for the government of India to lead this initiative from within the government. And it's been pretty successful. In a little under 5 years, this initiative was able to pretty much give every Indian a unique ID. And do it at less than $1 per ID. And interestingly, in the first year that it was applied, was used to deliver various government schemes, benefits to people, and so forth. The government was able to save more than it spent by eliminating waste, ghost beneficiaries, fake IDs in the system. So I conclude that this is an example of governments, even in countries like India, being largely efficient and effective, being able to do more with less pretty quickly. But of course, there are problems that arose from doing this. Problems of privacy of the data, security of the data. And many of these problems had to be raised in civil society, by the press, by activists, and of course, eventually had to be dealt with by the Supreme Court and the judiciary that had to rule on what was the legal constitutional use of this and what was not. I then turn to a case from China, not a very large developing country, and I look at its social credit system, a national program that tracks the economic and social reputation of citizens and businesses. The idea here was to give every Chinese citizen and business a credit rating based on their economic and social behavior. Now, in the West, we have some aspects of this. We have ratings, like credit scores and so on. But in China, they were going to combine that with potentially more intrusive measures. So for instance, including some of your personal behavior, your online behavior, or your behavior in the neighborhood or in public transport. And this would have implications, real consequences. So depending on your credit rating, if it was good, you would have access to loans and things like that. And if it was bad, you might be denied access to not only potentially loans, but also education, quality education, or even mobility. Now, interestingly, this program seems to generally be seen as positive by Chinese citizens. A survey in 2018 found that about 80% of people surveyed had joined a commercial social credit system. But interestingly, only a few of them were aware this was also part of a government system. At any rate, they still felt that this was something they approved of because they felt that it policed bad behavior and discouraged it, whether from individuals or from businesses. But we can see how something like this could easily be combined with, say, facial recognition, particularly in an authoritarian society, to scapegoat particular groups of people or individuals. So we could see a dystopian element to this. And in some ways, the situation we're in at the moment, the global situation, mirrors what we saw in the 30s when the world was recovering from the Great Depression. And we had these competing state systems, the Soviets in Russia and the Soviet Union. We had Nazi Germany, and then we had the New Deal in the US. And it was then that Keynes wrote that the authoritarian state systems of today seem to solve the problem of unemployment at the expense of efficiency and freedom, but may be possible by a right analysis to cure the disease whilst preserving efficiency and freedom. And it's that balance between effectiveness, efficiency, and freedom that I look at in the book. How can governments achieve that? And I argue that governments today have tools, they have new levers, new technologies and forms of organizing that can help them to be efficient and effective. But in order to ensure our privacy, security, and our freedoms, they need to adopt 5 principles as well as they develop these technologies and forms of organization. They need to be responsive to citizens, placing citizens at the heart of everything they do. They need to be inclusive and balance the competing interests of different groups in society. They need to constantly experiment, trying out new ideas, testing them, gaining the evidence, and then scaling them. They need to be entrepreneurial, that is, being proactive and manage risk. And finally, they need to be innovative generally, have a way to constantly do this. And I argue at the end of the book that citizens too have a crucial role in holding their governments to account and to these 5 principles. So let me, in the remaining time, just talk about each of these. And as I said, in the book, I really look at cases that exemplify these principles. So in the first chapter that I look at these principles, the first principle I look at is how states can be responsive to their citizens, how they can work outside in from the citizens' perspective rather than inside out from the perspective of the bureaucracy in their designing and delivery of solutions, and that they can even involve citizens in this process. I look at the case in this chapter of social care, particularly this organization in the Netherlands, Buurtzorg, that has revolutionized the delivery of social care in this way by putting patients first. I then turn to how states can balance the needs of different groups of citizens. Here I look at Denmark and how for several decades it has used this principle of flexicurity to balance the interests of employers who want flexibility in the labor market with that of job seekers who want stability and security. I also look at new ideas like the universal basic income and ask the question of whether they work. And of course, theoretically, there are reasons why universal basic income might work, and there are reasons why it might not. But what really matters is what actually happens when you try them out. And this is where I argue that states need to be experimental. They need to constantly try out new solutions in pilots, often to reduce the risk of failure, evaluate them, and then scale them when they have understood enough about what works. And here I look at 2 cases. One is the UK's behavioral insights team that has very successfully applied behavioral science and the experimental method to doing evidence-based policy, and the extension of that project, which is the What Works networks, which look at bodies of evidence and disseminate this evidence in sectors from education to criminal justice. Having looked at these principles about how the state should do its own work, I then turn to principles about how the state can manage the economy. And I look at how the state should be entrepreneurial in how it regulates the economy. And here I argue that the state needs to be proactive and engage early with new technologies and new players in order to ensure they flourish, but without the downsides, that the unanticipated negative consequences of new innovations. Here I look at M-Pesa, the service I mentioned earlier, and the role that the Kenyan Central Bank played in working in a proactive, engaged way with Vodafone to ensure that the service could be introduced, but also to protect consumers. I also look at how various US states and the UK have, in very creative, open ways, regulated autonomous vehicles to enable testing, even on roads where ordinary citizens might be, but ensuring it's done in a way that it's data driven, that a lot of reporting of data is done, and citizens are protected, even as companies can experiment with the technology. So what about cultivating the economy? Again, the state must be entrepreneurial, and this is what we might call industrial strategy. I return to the case of autonomous vehicles and look at how the UK, through its Center for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles, has created challenges for various players in the economy to come together to creatively explore the new opportunities with autonomous vehicles. So they have small pots of money, and this encourages consortia of all the different players who would participate, from large to small car companies, to software and telecoms companies, insurance companies, universities, and cities can come together to experiment, to identify what works and what doesn't. And this also helps the regulator to be able to nurture this new sector. We see something similar happening in the US where the space race is concerned, where NASA is increasingly working with private sector companies to help achieve its objectives of going to the moon and Mars. I also look at how cities like Barcelona are working with makers. I mentioned, the Raspberry Pi and the maker movement. We have these communities, we have these spaces, and I look at how cities are encouraging makers to do a kind of local manufacturing to meet local needs and demands. And really the emphasis here is on how states in nurturing the economy can row and steer the economy can steer the economy rather than doing all the heavy lifting and the rowing. The final principle is how the state can create a culture of innovation within it at different levels, and a system that encourages new ideas to be constantly bubbling up, tested, and then implemented or shelved. And so this question of how to create a culture of innovation within government is one I explore in this chapter. I look at how it can be done at the city level. I look at Boston and how the mayor's office has created a specific unit that is charged with coming up with new ideas, testing them, and then handing them over to the appropriate department. I look at the case of Canada and how this culture of innovation has been attempted at the city, provincial, and federal level, and how as you go from the city to the federal level, it becomes harder to do this because the systems are more complex. And I look at how in Bangladesh, a UNDP-led program has, over a period of about 10 years or so, initially created a digital Bangladesh vision, put it into practice, but really over time has created a culture of innovation throughout the bureaucracy. What they've tried to do is identify quick wins, simple things that with light touch digital technology could make a big difference to citizens. One of the things that they've done is to train their civil servants at various levels to empathize with the citizen, often going through the process that citizens would go through to get access to certain services. Then from the insights they get, they try to simplify the process of getting access to that government service, removing all the unnecessary steps and digitizing what can be digitized. And their objective is to measure the effect on the life of the citizen. And they have this framework of time that it takes the citizen to access a service, the cost to the citizen, and the number of visits that the citizen has to make. And they try to minimize these three. Having looked at how the government should be, I then turn to my final chapter, which is how should citizens be? And obviously, it's important for citizens to be engaged and informed. They must know how to choose good leaders and good teams. But I argue that it's not enough to just be vigilant at the time of elections. It's important to hold governments to account even within the period of between elections. And there are ways in which citizens can hold the government to account from outside, but perhaps the best way to influence how a government should be is to go and work for the government and change it from within. So that's my book in a nutshell. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I'll hand it back to Julian for our conversation.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Jaideep, for a wonderful sort of tour around these things. And there's so much material there that I think we could fascinatingly drill into. Now, I have to say, last time I asked you a question about your work, you said that was exactly, you were the person I thought of, and it was exactly the question I thought you would ask. And I'm slightly worried that I'm now being very predictable. But just before we come to the questions, and please do put some more questions in, can you say a little bit more about ideas of universal basic income? Because I have been pilots, you called for piloting. What's your assessment of how those have gone?
So yeah, I've been fascinated by the UBI. Obviously, there are lots of interesting proponents, and there are also variants on the UBI that have been around for a while and actually have been proposed by both libertarians and statists, or people you might think are in one camp or the other. So in the 60s, Milton Friedman, who was probably a classical libertarian or liberal, proposed a universal basic income. But so did Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a Democrat. And so did Richard Nixon. And actually, Nixon and Moynihan even collaborated. Interesting, isn't it, that a Democrat and a Republican might work together to introduce some similar sort of ideas. Alaska, the state of Alaska has been doing this for a while, perhaps using some of their oil money, so it's variants of this have been used for a while. but we have, I think this idea has gathered momentum, again, coming from both left and right. So, I think some of the candidates for Labour in the previous leadership round advocated for this. But so do several billionaires like Elon Musk and others. And I think the concern is really to do with some of this frugal innovation I've been talking about. If it's possible for people to do stuff like WhatsApp and then get hugely rich on it, but it also then can be done frugally, which is you don't need, like in the past, if you're going to have a scaled organization, to have tens of thousands of people working for you, but you could have a small team working for you. Then what happens to all those other people who would have been employed by big companies in the past? We see that companies of all sizes are automating, and perhaps something like COVID will accelerate that process. So the big question is one of employment. And if people work less and there are less jobs, then how do they support themselves? So there's that question. But there's also the question of, if people are going to be more entrepreneurial, and that's what we want to encourage, there won't be job takers, but job makers, then do we need to support that and sort of reduce the risk of failure and give them some kind of security, safety net? And then, of course, just simplifying the whole social security system that you have in many advanced countries. It's very complex, and that itself has administrative costs. Now, so those are arguments for it. But then you have the opponents who say this will sink the budget of many countries. It's just too expensive. It's silly to be giving millionaires the same, so why make it universal? Perhaps don't make it universal. And that they also think it'll undermine the dignity of work and the desire to work, and the connectedness that people have for work. So theoretically, now the question is, what happens in practice? And I talk about this particular city of Stockton in California, where the mayor, elected on the same day as Donald Trump was, except he's very different from Donald Trump, the youngest Black mayor of a major city, and came from, his mother was a single mother. His father was in prison when he was growing up, was very aware of these issues, and saw how his mother had benefited, and he himself and his siblings benefited from various government programs. And so that was one. And the other is in California, so he's aware of technology and so on. So they initiated this scheme when he was mayor. And interestingly, it was not funded by public money, but came from a philanthropist, actually a foundation that was interested in whether this works or not. So it's also linked in some ways with the experimental state, trying out experiments. And they gave a basic income to not many people, about 1,000 people, representative from different income groups. And the evidence was coming in just when COVID struck. And of course, the government then started to give people quite big amounts of money, households, families, and so on. And really, some of the evidence suggested that even $500 could make a huge difference a month to a family. And that people spent it on things that really mattered. This was not going to be spent on vice products. And that in some ways, so that's preliminary evidence. Finland did something that was very promising, but then governments changed and so on. So I think we still don't really know. I think we still need to collect a lot more evidence, but I think there's more pressure now, particularly with COVID, to really try this out.
Fascinating. We've had loads and loads of questions come in on lots of different subjects. I might actually start, because they also look at different parts of the world. I might start off in the UK with a question from Jeremy Baumberg, who points out that one repeated UK disaster has been the computerization of NHS records, which has been in the press today again. How might an experimental or frugal innovation approach be more effective than large external contracts, which has been the traditional system?
Yeah, great question. Fantastic question. And the inspiration for my ideas about frugal government come, as we were discussing, from my understanding of how it's done in the private sector. So, companies too have big and expensive failures. And in the past, their approach too was bigger is better. And that continues today too. It's not either or. You need to do some of that bigger, better stuff, big projects and so on, but you also need to do this frugal stuff. But companies almost exclusively, the big ones, did these big grand projects and lots of money riding on it, many years spent on it, and then the project would, for one reason or another, not work. Either the market had shifted or the technology landscape had shifted, and it would be a massive flop. Iridium comes to mind, the satellite phones, which were extremely expensive. They had to buy 77 satellites to make it work, and then mobile telephony took off, and that was a big, massive failure. So, there are many examples of that in the private sector. But what has happened over the last 20 years is that various pressures and also technological opportunities and forms of organizing, as I've said, have resulted in this idea of the lean startup and this methodology that many companies in Cambridge adopt, which is to fail fast and cheap and to iterate. So instead of coming up with the perfect product for the ideal customer who may not exist and the perfect product may not, that could take a lot of time and money and so on, and then the market could have shifted. You come up with a minimum viable product, a basic product. It could be a software like beta version, or it could be a prototype, and you give it to someone, someone in your network, a customer, to try out. And then you get feedback. And because you're giving them something that actually might work and that they might use, the feedback is meaningful. You're not just asking them, like Henry Ford famously said, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. You're actually giving, and Steve Jobs said the same thing. How can I ask people what they want unless I give them something? So you give them the prototype, they use it, and you get feedback, which you iterate on. And they say, okay, we don't like this feature, we like that. And you do this rapidly with the customer, and very quickly, you come up with something that suits them. And then if it suits them, there are very likely to be others who like it, and you can scale. And so this has been used very successfully by the digital giants. Some of them have grown so large on the back of this kind of thing. That the larger incumbent companies that did the bigger is better are starting to wake up to this. I was just talking to somebody from IBM today, a group of people, and they were saying the same thing. So now the question is, can governments do the same thing? And why not? And they can do this themselves when they're developing some new service, digital service often, or they can encourage others to do it. And in fact, this approach has been used by the UK for regulation. So this idea of a regulatory sandbox, where, let's say in fintech, where some of the fintech innovations could have huge benefits to people. You could financial inclusion, reduce the costs, and make it more efficient. But they could also have huge negative effects because banking is systemic, as we know from the last financial crisis. So you can't afford to have a fintech just go rogue, and and same thing with M-Pesa in Kenya. So you do this kind of lean startup approach. You give them a sandbox, and you say you can try out your idea on a few real customers. So that way you get real feedback. But if it fails, there's no systemic cost. And you've learned quickly, we've learned as well what the issues are. If we find that there's a success, it's a success, we can let you scale. So those principles, I think, are already being applied in government, and we just need more of that.
Fascinating. There's a lot of questions coming up about issues outside the UK. So I'd like just to capture some of the tone of a few that I'll put together. So Sonia Gupta says, "Sir, how does the culture and norms of the country affect government functioning? In a similar matter to how the perceptions and attitudes of management and board members of a company impact its business." And can I couple that with a couple of questions that we've had? So one from Philip: how can your ideas be applied to many African governments that aren't trusted by the citizens and can't afford to be innovative because of very low tax to GDP ratios? And similarly from Nwaj Jabuno, how do countries with institutional corruption balance doing all of this? So this sounds great, but how does it really apply in different contexts?
Yes, yeah, brilliant questions. Really, really, the key questions to be asking, not just of developing countries, but any country. We have forms of corruption in any country, and special interest groups, lobbying. Does that sound familiar? So yes, but I understand, as someone who has a lot of links with India, in some developing countries, you have endemic corruption, you have retail corruption in addition to high-level corruption. And yes, it's true that generally speaking, citizens don't trust their governments in those countries. And yes, culture and norms and institutions play a very important role. So where to begin? I think first, let's talk about the question of trust. Why do we trust anyone, but particularly our governments? I know this is a topic dear to your heart, Julian, you've talked about it many times. But my take is that, and interestingly, there is an annual survey across many countries by an organization called Edelman. And they have found consistently, they ask people's trust in government, business, media, and NGOs, third sector. And they track this annually. And for several years, government is at the bottom of the list. And this is across countries. And interestingly, business is trusted more than government. And there are two components to the trust, what go into trust. One is the competence, and the other is integrity of these institutions. And generally speaking, people think that the private sector, companies, businesses are more competent than governments, but they think that governments may have a bit more integrity. Of course, that changes and it depends on so we might trust generally speaking, we might trust government's instincts and, a bit more than that of companies, because we think companies are purely in it for their own purposes. But we see companies as being more competent. And I think that's what I try to focus on in the book, is how can governments, wherever they might be, do their work better? And to the point about taxes, not better doesn't mean do it by spending more. So how can they do their work better? How can they be more efficient and effective? But then you have this problem of, what if they were just too efficient and effective and introduce a kind of authoritarian surveillance bureaucracy, which can be done? And, the ID case, the social credit case, so to control their populations. And that's when we might stop trusting them again. So, that's the balance, and it's not an easy balance. But I think that brings us to the question of norms and culture. And here I find the example of Bangladesh really interesting. This access to information, A2I program I mentioned, UNDP led, I think is a very interesting case. So you start with a political party in its manifesto, setting out its stall, saying that they believed in digital Bangladesh. So this is in 2007, 2008. There's a vision. They're going to digitize, government and make it more responsive to people and more competent, therefore. And so they got UNDP funding. They got some very committed people. I write about them in the book to run this program. And initially it was about what many people think. It's about technology. It's about spending. We've got to, put up infrastructure. We've got to have computers, and we've got to have 3G, whatever it is, and Wi-Fi and all this kind of stuff. And yes, you need a bit of that. Without that, you're not going to have anything. But they realized more than anything, it was also the mindset of the bureaucrats, and not just the ones at the top, but all the way down. And something that I think you see, particularly in developing countries, I'll take India, for instance, you have a 19th century mindset in the government, in the bureaucracy. There is this feeling that the bureaucracy exists to control the populace, and that without that control, the country will just split in a million directions, And, perhaps that was true in the 19th century. You did need to have that control, but it's no longer true. You need to have a more participatory form of government, particularly if it's a democracy. So in Bangladesh, what they've done is they've done this training, and it's a continuous process of training bureaucrats from the top down. And they do this empathy training, which I find fascinating. So in a 5-day workshop, you spend the first day understanding about things like, service design and, some basic ideas. Of course, they change the language to make it more suited to government. So they don't call it business process re-engineering. They call it service simplification process. Okay. So they can analyze any government service, look at all the steps that are needed, eliminate all those that are unnecessary, and then think about, where digital can help. But then the second day, they actually go into the field and they do secret shopping. They actually have to stand in line to get a particular government service from a department that's not their own. And then they come back and they're very critical. They say it's awful. And then the next or third day, they do go to their own department and do the same thing. And that's when the scales fall from their eyes, and they realize, how the public perceives them very differently from how they think, they think they're doing a noble job and so on, but actually the public doesn't see it that way. And then they come back and try and redesign their own service, and then they go back into their departments to try and make this happen. And of course, not, many go back and nothing happens, but some go back and change happens. So I think, these are fascinating questions, and really, that's how change will happen, I think.
So fascinating thing here. We're getting lots more interesting questions coming in. I'm tempted to put this one question, since you've mentioned India, from Guneet Malik. Can Indian citizens ever trust their government? And what would your one tip be to get them out of the current COVID crisis, since it's such a hot topic at the moment? One tip only.
Oh, wow. Okay, big one, and very close to home here. So how can Indians trust their government better? So one of the things, so I mentioned competence, right? Just being more responsive to citizens' needs. And, there are huge needs in a country like India, huge aspirations, particularly young population. There are huge expectations. So they expect a lot from their governments. And so in that chapter where I talk about responsive, how can governments be responsive to their citizens? I talk about two ways you can do this. You can either bring citizens closer to the government, and digitization is one way to do that. So you cut out all the intermediaries, and the Unique ID project in some ways is that. It cut out all the middlemen, including these fake beneficiaries, who had fake IDs, who are drawing down benefits from the government, and in fact, the intended beneficiaries are denying intended beneficiaries what was due to them. So you can use digitization to increase the transparency and efficiency and bring citizens closer to you, or you can go closer to citizens. And by that, I mean, you could relocate the locus of power closer to local government, the opposite of what's happened in Britain, unfortunately, over the years. So instead of keeping all the power, and I mentioned the 19th century attitude, you keep all the power in the center and you control from the center, you devolve power to, regions, states, provinces, and then eventually to cities. I've had many cases of mayors being able to make a difference. I think it's partly because the scale is different. The time frame of 5 years, you can do quite a lot at that scale. Often mayors are from the city. They understand the local community. They're understood by the community. They know the problems. They know the solutions. And they can do things in a way that perhaps it's harder to do at the state or the federal level. Certainly that's true in big countries like the US or Canada. If you look at what's dysfunctional in many of those countries, it's at the central level, not at the states or the cities. I think that's, to me, a key in a country like India. Competence means being responsive. This means devolving power to states, and then you get a healthy rivalry potentially. And I've seen, the discourse and the criteria and conditions in India change on the ground in states. Chief ministers of states compete with each other increasingly on development issues, not on identity politics or populism, because that's what their people want, and that's how they will win elections and be re-elected, typically speaking. Now, coming to the pandemic, that's a really tough one. We were talking before we started on how this confluence of things. The vaccine, that's it. You just have to get as much of the vaccine into arms as possible. Now, there are two problems there. One is India doesn't have enough of the vaccine, even though it's the pharmacy of the world and potentially could create that capacity, but then depends on inputs coming from other countries. But more importantly, it's again, the competence of governments to roll it out. So the UK has done fabulously, because you've had this very nice partnership when things work really well between the third sector, Oxford coming up with the early idea. Then you have the big company that can do all the clinical trials and the scaling of it, manufacturing at scale. And then you have the NHS that can then get the jabs in arms. India lacks that kind of combination and that coordination. But a crisis is an opportunity. So if India can do that, then that will have set up some kind of infrastructure for this kind of better sort of collaboration between all these parts of society.
So you touched a bit on the role of the state and how to rethink that and devolution. There's a few questions which pick up on that. So Jorge Aponte Gomez points out the problems happening now in Colombia and around the world, and asks whether we should be rethinking the role of a state. How does a state keep essential services going without losing direction? And ultimately, could anarchy be the end of the story if you move that way? So I think that's the first thing. There's a couple of other related questions I'd like to come on to.
Yeah. So it's interesting that would come from Colombia, right? So a big concern with anarchy, and that's, I was characterizing that as the 19th century approach, but clearly, you can have that in the 21st century too. The fear that, especially in a large country with a lot of differences, you could have anarchy, you can have, just parts of the country splittings, secessionism. And that fear probably is still dominant in many countries, and that drives this kind of centralization of power, this kind of mindset of control, and this mindset of very top-down, often heavy-handed government. Now, clearly you need that some level of control and stability and security, and again, you need a competent government to do that. But it can't be too heavy-handed, because then you could have the opposite effect in trying to keep the country together. Being heavy-handed and trying to centralize everything could result in huge unrest and splittist movements. So, a historian of India, for instance, sorry to go back to the subcontinent, I know that region a little bit better than Latin America, Ram Gua, who has written about India primarily, but has pointed out how many of India's neighbors have had civil war, and which has, in some cases, like in Pakistan, split the country into two countries, or in the case of Sri Lanka, had led to a civil war, which was with terrible consequences. Nepal has had that. India has been so far spared that kind of civil war, because very early it devolved power to the states, and it recognized that there was so much diversity in the country, linguistically, for instance, that it just would not work to have one language. It would not work to have one religion. Now, of course, that these things are being questioned today, and I think with possibly dangerous effects. But that you would let people have some freedoms within a framework, a constitutional framework that ensured the integrity of the country. So, this balance between giving people some liberty, but also control. And again, it comes back to sheer competence. Again, if a country and a government can do that, if it's competent, it can do that. So that's it, I guess.
So moving on, only very slightly from that, Gunit Malik asked about resiliency. So are states that rely more on light touch, nimble interventions in times of crisis more resilient?
Wow, I know Gunit, and I know where that's coming. Gunit is first-rate brain and mind. That's a very subtle question. So I'm inclined to think that you can be light touch and competent. That's my whole point about frugal innovation, is that you're not spending a lot of money, you're not trying to do all the heavy lifting and the rowing, but that doesn't mean that you're laissez-faire. So that's that middle ground between the libertarian, laissez-faire, give people total liberty, which will result in anarchy, versus the state must do everything, which is how it was in many countries, not just the Soviet Union, but in China, many of the third world countries, like India or Mexico. The state was seen as being the only agent of change and even economic activity. And I think that's just, overkill, and in the other direction. And so the ideal middle ground for me is one where the state knows what it and only it can do, and does that well, but is very cognizant of what are things that other parts of the economy and society can do better, and lets them get on with it. But of course, that's also not a case for laissez-faire. So, when we're talking about the private sector, when I talk about regulation, it's very important for the state to be proactive and not laissez-faire when it comes to autonomous vehicles or fintech or the space race or whatever it is, because you need smart regulation to ensure that technology will thrive. For instance, to ensure there are standards. If there are no standards, then that technology will not take off. There'll just be too much uncertainty. but also to know how to strike that balance between openness and letting companies participate, but without endangering citizens, So in Kenya, the central bank could have said to Vodafone, go ahead, do it, wonderful. But what if the system failed and, people whose their little savings just evaporated into cyberspace? So you've got to be able to ensure that on the one hand, you can let the company go ahead because this could be transforming. It could do financial inclusion, bring people outside the formal economy into the formal economy. The banks were not able to do it. The mobile phone companies could do it, let them come in. But equally, how do we ensure very quickly what the issues are and protect customers, ensure the robustness of the system, ensure that it meets money laundering regulations globally, ensure that legally it's not interfering with what it means to be a bank, and so on. And so, that kind of very proactive, smart regulation, not heavy-handed, but equally not laissez-faire, is very important. And the same with industrial strategy, so that's what I call steering, not growing, coordinating the activities of others, creating an ecosystem, nurturing that ecosystem, but letting others get on with it. And again, the case of the vaccine in the UK is a good example of that. This coordination between the different parts of society that can do their bits well.
We've had a comment from John Tanburn who says, as a former cox of the Cambridge boat in the boat race and of Jesus College's boat, he believes very much in steering and not rowing. So I think he agrees completely with the message. So thank you, John.
Wonderful.
But I'd like to pick up on a theme which I don't think we've quite touched on here, which is about accountability. Because one of the issues about decentralizing is there. So David Stoughton points out that this is a big issue in the UK and elsewhere. Ministers have to approve stages. That can delay projects and increase costs because failing at any stage brings it to an end. But fundamentally, how do you solve the problem of accountability and the press watching what happens with the sort of frugal approach that you're describing?
Yes. Now, I'm not a political scientist, and I have to make that clear. So, my knowledge of how these things work is probably mostly informed by the private sector. But in the private sector, you have companies that innovate all the time, and they are accountable. They may not be accountable to the citizen at large, but they are accountable to their shareholders. They are accountable to their customers. They're accountable to their employees. They're accountable to civil society, which increasingly holds them to account. They're accountable to the press. And so, I would think that the private sector faces some of the pressures. Now, admittedly, the pressures in government, and I've talked to many UK and Indian civil servants, Nigerian civil servants, Malaysian civil servants, they all say the same thing. They say that the pressures when you're a civil servant and the public sphere are much greater, they would say, than in the private sector, because it's public money, because it's political, because the press is waiting for every wrong move and step and amplifies it. And of course, if there's already little trust in government, then the people are also generally skeptical. So that maybe there is a little bit more in government, but there is accountability in the private sector, and the private sector therefore has to innovate and do that responsibly. And that's why they've come up with these various devices, this lean startup approach, also to reduce its own costs and the costs of errors and mistakes. So I don't think accountability gets in the way of competence. If anything, it encourages it, and which is why I think citizens have such an important role to play, not just in democratic societies, but particularly in democratic societies, because they hold their governments to account. And as I say, if even that doesn't work, go and work for the government, and we have many of our students who do that and change it from within.
So that actually takes me very nicely onto the next set of questions I was planning to ask you, because you talked a lot about how citizens should choose good leaders. Ian LeBeau has a very simple question: how?
So again, I draw on my knowledge of leadership in the private sector, but also in the public sector, because I've taught and met many civil servants. And of course, one always has a view on politicians and political leaders. And so my sort of take on how you choose leaders is that, first of all, it's, you try to depersonalize it. It's not about the identity, the social identity of the person. It is about their policies, their skills, and their team. And so, I think that's how we have to ideally, rationally think about our leaders and choose them. And, maybe this happens to some extent in the developed world, but it's not the way politics is done in much of the developing world. I was just before this session on a session with Latin Americans, former students of ours in Latin America, very personalized politics. I know from the knowledge of the subcontinent, it's personalized. It's about the individuals and their identities and so on. And we need to get away from that. It's about the policies. What do these people stand for? What are their skills? Have they done something like this before? And by done, I mean actually made change happen by running big organizations in any sector, public, private, third sector. Have they done this before? Have they done it in government before? And then it's not just about the individual. It's about their team. Who are their, what party are they from? Who else is in the party? What are their credentials? What have they done before? Who's in their immediate team? What's their experience? So when I wrote that chapter, my editor said correctly and cuttingly, but this is like saying to a student, study hard and be intelligent. And I'm afraid that's what it is. We have to, as citizens, study hard and be intelligent and, focus on the things that really matter.
So Edward Lee, hello Edward, asks a related question to this about citizens' assemblies. So do you think that in well-informed citizen assemblies can unlock resistance, the scale and pace of change needed? I mean, you particularly talk about climate emergency there, but how can we encourage government to devolve decision-making powers to citizens' assemblies if we should?
Oh, that's a great question. And actually, that was something that I only encountered when I was more or less at the end of writing the book. And I heard about this in the context of Brexit. And I think it was proposed by one of the leadership candidates for the Conservative Party. And I thought that's a very creative idea. And he gave as an example how Ireland had gone about, the Republic of Ireland had gone about their referendum around abortion, if I'm not mistaken. Or was it same-sex marriage? I think it was something very emotive to a country, that has been very religious, very Catholic. And how these citizens' assemblies actually got ordinary people from different walks of life actually talk to each other in a civilized way, and to see the other point of view, and then the whole debate was much more reasoned and rational, and then presumably the decision making was also more reasoned and rational. So I was very struck by that. I didn't get a chance to write about it. I don't know enough about it, but I think that's certainly a very creative idea, and I'd love to see, again, in the spirit of experimentalism, more such experiments and evidence about when they work, how they should be done, and so on.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and also there's a question about the formation of these assemblies, but also whether they should be non-binding, as in the case of Ireland, or binding, and how, what is the role of democratic process in any of this?
Well, to be honest, I haven't thought about that, but I think that's a very interesting topic, very interesting issue to look at, and it's probably slightly on the margin of what I was trying to do, which was looking more at governments and less at the citizens. But I think that's a really nice one. I mean, the closest I get to looking at communities is in that chapter on innovative state, where I actually look at what Barcelona, as I was saying, has tried to do with these makers, these communities of makers. Now, that's much more in the economic realm rather than in the political realm. But I also I do cover some of this in the chapter on the responsive state, because this is potentially an example of bringing the people closer to government and actually having them do policy, isn't it? I mean, so I think that's actually a very creative idea, and we need more work on that.
So one aspect of the people and how they're interacting and choosing leaders, somebody with a curious name of anonymous attendee asks, how concerned are you about the rise of populism in the UK and in the West in general? And I would add actually around the world, because I think populism is far from being a Western-only issue.
Yes, to some extent, it was my own concerns with populism and perhaps even bafflement at it and why it had come about and what to do about it that led me to write the book. So, I mean, I only partly joke, but the book was a kind of therapy for me to to recover from the shocks of Trump, Brexit, Bolsonaro, Erdogan, Putin, Xi Jinping, whatever. You can go down the list. And my bafflement at this whole development, which has, in a sense, very interestingly and perhaps creatively upended the old debate, between libertarians and statists, because here you had people who were confounding this logic, and now we have a conservative government that's all about splashing the money and things that you might expect from the other side. So I mean, it's worrying, I think, because I think again it goes to the personalization of politics, identity issues, and culture wars, rather than what I consider the real issues, which is, are you making citizens' lives actually better? Are you dealing with these big challenges, but equally opportunities of new revolutionary technologies that could transform our societies, both for good, but also in a dystopian way? These populists seem so far from recognizing those realities that's what really worries me. And don't give the reasoned citizen an option. They don't give them a reasonable choice. They give them the wrong options or the wrong choices. So I am worried about it. And again, to me, the antidote is not more populism, left or right, but actually competence in government. And at some level, I think the pandemic may have done that, horrific as it has been. I think that reality check where people who may have been inclined to go off the deep end a bit and say, it's all, we don't trust our governments, they're all crooks or whatever, so what does it matter, let's just go with a wild card, let's try Trump, what's the worst that could happen? Well, you saw what could happen, and you probably will think again next time. Anyway, that's my take, and perhaps that's wishful thinking.
It reminds me slightly of the wonderful Mencken quote. There's always a well-known solution to every human problem: neat, plausible, and wrong. Questions about how we communicate that. We're still getting lots of questions flooding in, so I feel we're not going to quite get through all of them. One interesting question that's come in talks about, you've mentioned elected governments, but also civil service. So elected governments have a fixed term, whereas tackling critical issues often requires long-term planning continuity. But on the other side, how can you transform a state when the non-elected civil service is typically very change averse and very bureaucratic?
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. And I have thought about that question for a long time in the context of the big corporation, because you have a variant of that problem in the corporation. Many large established companies attract a certain type of person. They attract a manager rather than an entrepreneur, people who want stability and who are actually inherently, in a way, risk averse. And then when they get into the corporation, are very happy to go with the structures and processes of the corporation, which actually work against change. They defend the status quo. And I think you see that in spades in the government as the bureaucracy, which attracts the most, perhaps risk-averse, stability-seeking, orderly kind of person. Now, that's wonderful that you have those people, because at some level, you want some, solid people to do that, and who, want to care about the stability of institutions and so on. But then they're not particularly inclined to try out new things, and they are not particularly inclined to fail. And of course, they get punished for it. So there's a double whammy. So, in that chapter on the innovative state, I do spend quite some time thinking about that and writing about examples. So in Boston, in the mayor's office, they recognized this problem, and they thought the departments, there's two problems there. One is they'll typically have career civil servants who are not, interested in trying out new things. Typically, they're interested in maintaining the status quo. So you have the wrong sort of person in the departments. You want some people who are a bit entrepreneurial, but equally you don't want cowboys, right? You want people who care about the public interests and so on. So they created a separate unit, a kind of skunk works. They gave it a fancy title, Mona, Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. And they got these very entrepreneurial people who might ordinarily have gone to work for tech companies in a place like Boston, but had a public spirit and cared about change in government. And so not a very big team, small team, and of these creative people who understood technology, but also cared about the city. Try out new ideas, often with academics or startups, try them out with citizens, experiment quickly, come up with an app, whatever it was, test it, get some data, see if it worked, and in that sort of lean startup kind of way. And then, if it failed, it failed. If it was looking successful, hand it over to a department and say, here's something, we've tested it, we've de-risked it for you because we've done the testing, here's the evidence, and we'll help you scale it. So, and if it succeeds, we'll give you the credit. And if it fails, you can always blame us. So, that's I thought a very clever strategy to deal with these problems. And or you do training like you do in Bangladesh, you sort of train people and you give them the tools to make change happen, and then you support them with mentorship and things like that. But that's a big one. And I think there are things that, we can and should do to increase you don't want too many of them, but you want to have a few of these intrapreneurs, these govpreneurs, as they call them in Bangladesh, people who are within government, but are looking to change and see opportunities and can bring other people along.
So I agree very much with that personally. I mean, this idea of encouraging people to be allowed to fail sensibly and to try something and not to punish them is crucially important. I've been trying to make some of that happen in the NHS in sensible ways. But moving on to another question. So Jeffrey Vernon says, I can see merits in this middle way, but what are the incentives for a state? Is it a matter of waiting for good people to do the right thing and they should do all of this stuff because it's good and our leaders should be benevolent? Or are there other drivers of state behavior and performance that would lead them to this sort of outcome?
Yeah, another great question. Yeah, I don't think you can just rely on benevolence and luck. That's not going to get you very far systematically. It might once in a while, but I think there's several pressures. One is particularly in democratic societies, but not only. The public are putting they have huge expectations of their elected officials or even unelected officials, and they put pressure on them and can organize now in protests. We've seen wave after wave of protest about all kinds of things. Most recently police brutality or whatever it is. So I think citizens, activism. I think citizens who are particularly who care about these issues and are talented should go and work for government. There's huge opportunities in government. The Unique ID project that I talked about, there were in India, much of the technology development was done by volunteers who came from the top tech companies in the world, from the Microsofts, IBMs, Googles, and so on. Some of them were Indian, but not only. And they were motivated by the challenge. What an enormous technical challenge, but also the possibility of making something happen, that, you probably often would not be able to do in even the large corporation, something, that would really change the country. And so I think it's getting people out, encouraging people out. And I think where we are in the university is a good place to do that, to really encourage our students to go into that. I think, I'm very impressed by the role that, the likes of the UNDP or the OECD and those kinds of organizations have played in being change makers. In partnership often with governments, they have to, but they can bring in that a little bit of outside money and prestige. They can compare across countries, and I've been struck by just how much importance they place on competence of public officials, particularly the civil servants and the bureaucracy, and how they are constantly thinking about and advising governments on how to improve how they run the government. And they are very interested in what works in different places and how that can be adapted and adopted. So yeah, I think there are those kinds of outside pressures that you need as well.
So we're out of time, and there's still loads of questions. So I'm going to finish, I think, with just one more. Again, from Guneet. When is frugal intervention not the right tool for governments? When should they not do this?
Again, wonderful question from Guneet. And again, it's not a panacea. It has its place. It's a tool. It's one of many tools in a good government's toolkit. Just as it is in the private sector. So, you can't have a big company like, say, AstraZeneca or, IBM or Microsoft or Google just doing frugal innovation. And in fact, many of them still very much do the old style, bigger is better, for good reason. Sometimes, that actually changes the world. A new drug is something that may be science driven rather than market based. And takes a lot of money and time to do. So there's certain things, you just have to do it in that systematic, big budget, long time horizon way. But the biggest companies have realized that, they can't just do that. And in fact, there are many startups that just by doing the frugal stuff have grown very big, very quickly, often using data in a smart way and digital, and are now threatening them in their sectors. You take the Amazons that are getting into healthcare or financial services and so on. So I think it's that understanding of what's right at the right time. So a lot of the frugal innovation can be done at the fuzzy front end and can be usually done by smaller units. And that's why, a biotech company was more likely to come up with the vaccine. But then you needed the big company to actually do all the clinical trials, and the manufacturing at scale and so on. So I think there are certain stages of the innovation process when this faster, better, cheaper stuff works, but then there are stages when you need to be more systematic. And I think just governments need to recognize that and have this as a tool in their toolkit.
Jaideep, you've been utterly fantastic. You've covered so many fascinating things. We have lots and lots of questions left, covering everything from Bitcoin, AI and trust, the farmers' protests in India, and much, much more. I will just finish with a comment from Irene Hanasan, which came in about how encouraging you to interact with governments, and in particular send a copy of a book to as many governments and members of political parties as possible. So I can see a big stack of posts leaving the judge very shortly. But thank you so much for joining us for this really inspirational talk. And I think it's been really fascinating, given so much food for thought. I would encourage people, of course, to buy the book as well as the previous ones, available from all good bookstores near you. And I even have a copy myself to show, so we can do matching ones. But it really is a fantastic book to read, and well worth it. To those, so thank you very much, Jaideep. And if you've enjoyed this, please do come to some of our other events at the Intellectual Forum. Next week, we're going to be joined by Gus Casely-Hayford, who's the director of V&A East, the new museum. So Gus is an amazing curator and cultural historian who'll be talking about museums, what their future is, with huge experience running the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art in the US, having organized the biggest celebration of Africa Britain has ever hosted. Much more really insightful, fascinating character to hear from next week. But that's all we have tonight. Jaideep, thank you again very much for joining us. Have a good evening wherever you are.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you everyone for joining. It's been brilliant. I've just thoroughly enjoyed this session. What great questions. What a wonderful conversation.